Thank you. Good evening. Today is June 14th, 2021, and it is 6:02. As a quorum of the committee is in attendance via video conference, I would like to call to order the meeting of the Central Health Budget and Finance Committee. For Agenda 1 is to approve the minutes of the January 2021 meeting of the Central Health Budget and Finance Committee. Manager Valadez, go and unmute and give your motion.
I move that we adopt the minutes of the our last strategic planning. Here it is.
And finance.
I'm sorry. Budget and finance meeting that was held on January the 20th.
Second.
All those for say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed to use the same motion? You're opposed, Senator Valadez?
No, I just wanted to clarify that the year is 2020. We're in 21, so someone might get confused. And so I need to add January 20th of 2020. Thank you.
No,
no.
It was 2021, January.
It was 2021.
Oh, on the minutes, it says 2020.
Okay.
So you need to change we need to update the dates?
Yeah,
We will correct that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
The next motion is to receive and discuss a presentation on the proposed Central Health fiscal year 2021 end of the year estimates and fiscal year 2022 budget. Mike Giesling, Jeff Knodel, Lisa Owens, and Lester Hanaher will be presenting. Members, this is a preliminary presentation by the staff of an outline of an upcoming budget. There is no motion or action tonight on the budget. If you have specific questions about an aspect of the budget, you can send an email to Jeff or Lisa so they can brief you individually, and anticipate your interest on the topic when the budget is presented on the June 30th Board of Managers meeting.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'll kick it off and then I'll hand it over to Jeff, Lisa, and Lester. And thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to provide some opening comments. As you have seen and participated in the Strategic Planning Committee, we've outlined the strategic objectives that have been set by the board, and then some of the specific projects and opportunities that we have as part of those committee hearings. And now it's time to pivot over and look at how we invest and how we put funds behind those projects. And so what we are anticipating is an increase in the level of services that we provide and an increasing number of people that we serve as people continue to live in impoverished conditions in areas all over Travis County. So I think that the other thing that I'll point out is that this is an opportunity for us to present some information to you and provide some context to it. Typically we do this a little bit later. We bumped it up because of the July hearing schedule. But please, by all means, as the chair noted, take note of your questions and let's get them in so that we can address them in subsequent presentations. You'll notice some significant changes in here, especially in the revenue, as you all have seen and heard firsthand what's happening in Travis County with property values. That has resulted in a significant jump in revenue, and you'll see some changes that we've made to the tax rate over effective as a result of your guidance and input from the last meeting. But on the investment side, or the expenditure side, I should say, but I think of it in terms of investing in people's lives. But yes, on the uses side, you'll see a significant contingency reserve. And I think that reflects some of the comments that were made earlier about there is a lot of uncertainty in healthcare financing and in the environment that we're in. But having those carry forwards, albeit them significant, is certainly prudent as we work through the next few years. So nonetheless, this is, again, the first opportunity that we have to present something to you, provide some context, and look forward to many, many more conversations, including community conversations around this budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Good evening, Lisa Owens, Deputy CFO. So we are here tonight, as everyone has said. I will echo, there is no action. This is our first presentation on a proposed budget. And we will have many more budget conversations to come in August and September as we move forward to adopt a budget as well as a proposed tax rate later this summer. So as you're aware from conversations at the strategic planning and previous board meetings, the FY 2022 budget will support our key initiatives to achieve one of three objectives in our Central Health Strategic Work Plan, and that work plan's in place until 2024. And I've just reshared these here, developing and executing a healthcare delivery plan based on people in place, implementing a patient-focused and coordinated healthcare system, and then of course ensuring the sustainable financial model for healthcare delivery. In addition, I just want to also highlight that the dollars in the proposed budget support the components of a high-functioning healthcare system and the work that we're doing to prepare for additional investments and priorities that will be learned from the system of care work, which I know you're receiving robust updates on through our strategic planning committee and other leaders in the organization. So I wanted to share a few highlights of what you're going to see in the numbers tonight. So as we talked about, the tax revenue will be increasing. And after our last presentation, we have developed a year-end estimate, and I'll talk through that in a little more detail. And we've also used then those updated numbers to update our long-term outlook. After looking at this, we have prepared this budget at 6% over the maintenance and operations level, which is less than we had previously discussed 6.9%. And we do feel like that slightly lower number does give us more the funds that we need, and Jeff will go through some of the models looking at the long-term forecast in order to achieve our goals and maintain enough reserves. The budget also contains significant additional investments in primary care and specialty care, including investments in MAP and MAP Basic. And we do not anticipate funding a hospital payment model in FY22. Those funds are not included. As well, you know that the DSRIP program we've been talking about for a long time is phasing out, so you'll see a reduction in intergovernmental transfers. So we also have a commitment to operational excellence and our staff. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, as you will see additional investments in that area. And I want to highlight the robust business planning process that we've had in place for several years now. We used that again this year. We had over 20 business cases presented. They are reviewed by multi-level teams in order to ensure that they support those strategic priorities. But you'll see in healthcare delivery, significant increases through this process, approximately $7.3 million in system-based planning work that will show up in areas like specialty care and primary care, but also additional staff, not only in eligibility, but as you know, the Medical Executive Board has been put into place, and we are developing a clinical practice, and we will see investments in staff in that area. And then finally in joint technology to support the infrastructure that's needed in order to deliver the care and services to our MAP and MAP Basic patients. We also had business case requests for administrative projects, hub program, as well as DEI support, and investing in new staffs to support not only new initiatives, but expanding services as we grow. And that was approximately 8 new FTE. And then you're also going to see an investment in staff through a merit increase that's incorporated in the salaries and benefits. So our salaries budget has an estimate for benefits, but it also has an estimate in there for potential merit increase that can range from 0 to 5% this year. And that is a little bit higher than previous years, which was about 3%. So we continue to try and thrive to have a low tax rate. We always like to recenter on the fact that compared to our peers, we do have a fairly low, this is last year's data, but we do have a fairly low tax rate at just 4.3% of the average taxpayer's bill, that it lives in a part of Austin that has certain taxing districts. And we also, though, have Central Texas, good news. which is challenging, as we know for many of our families and many communities, in that the assessed values continue to rise significantly. So you'll see, we have seen the preliminary estimate. We get that in April. We do not get the certified roll until July. So when we come back later this month, we'll have more information about some of the initiatives and programs in healthcare services, and any questions that you guys send us, we can come back June 30th and answer those. But when we come back in August, we will have a certified roll and numbers that will be more specific. But our partners at Travis Central Appraisal District have estimated that the taxable assessed values for our area are $236 billion and last year were $218 billion. That is an increase of over 8%, and is driving a lot of the increase in revenue. So I want to spend a little time on this slide because for those of you who've been on the board for a while, this is some information to really just kind of dig in a little bit more on the tax rate that we're proposing. We've had a lot of changes. So we're showing you 3 years, FY 2021, and the proposed rate and information from this year. First of all, noting that the average taxable homestead value, and we'll provide more information later in the process about bands and different taxpayer impacts, but this is just the average homestead in our jurisdiction, is at $386,000 this year. That's an 8.7% increase year over year, which is going to be driving a lot of the taxpayer impact. We also are proposing an M&O rate that is 6% over no new revenue, and no new revenue is formally known as the effective rate. And that rate is 11.1449 cents per $100 of valuation. As we talked about for the past couple months when we've presented on the notice of intent to issue certificates of obligation, that certificates of obligation does impact the tax rate on the debt service side. And that is about $8.64 of additional tax as a result of that additional issuance. And that that rate is used to pay the certificates of obligation once they are issued. So we have calculated based on year over year, the average taxable assessed value in, I believe you can see my cursor, I think, in FY21 versus FY22, that there would be an increase of just under $50 at $49.30. And we kind of broke out, again, additional information. As Jeff presented in the special called meeting that we just ended, we also are proposing increasing the over 65 and disabled homestead exemption to $100,000, and we are at the maximum allowable at 20% for homestead for under 65 or not disabled. I'm going to hand it over to Jeff. He's going to talk through a lot of the financial risks that we're facing, as well as a few additional models that we've updated on our longer term look.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So we're going to look at a couple of reserve models that you guys are used to seeing year over year. But it always helps just to take a step back and just look at, from a overall perspective, what sort of financial risk exists for Central Health. Certainly not limited to only these, but just what are out there that we just keep in mind that exist and that we may potentially have some exposure to in the future. And certainly there's an economic risk. We've been fortunate in Austin and in Travis County to have a robust economy. There's always that possibility that there is an economic downturn that is impactful to this area, or that there's high levels of inflation that can cause that economic downturn. So either one of those is certainly a risk. From a regulatory standpoint, we've seen a lot of changes over the past few years. Certainly have been a lot of funding changes. There is some uncertainty related around future supplemental programs, in particular around the funding for the uninsured. If you recall, there was a approval of 1115 waiver extension for 10 years, and that was recently rescinded. So HHSC on the state side has begun the process again. It's just a risk that's out there related to just the uncertainty of what does it look like in the future. We do have one more year of the 1115 waiver remaining, which would be, it would end at the end of next year. Unfortunately, related to the next bullet point, though, the Deseret program or the Deseret portion of the 1115 waiver ends at the end of this year. And in the approved extension prior to the rescission of the extension, there were no alternative funding programs that carried over specifically related around continuance of the Deseret program. So from a central health perspective, what's the impact of that? Well, you know, the Deseret program funds some cost in the community care collaborative that would transition to central health. And we, you know, we've been planning for this for years under the hopes of let's be conservative and not try to foresee that there would be some other supplemental program that would replace funding for Deseret. That just hasn't happened, and it's unfortunately gone as planned thus far. The other piece related around the Deseret program and outcomes that we've accomplished is just maintaining those levels of health or of accomplishment that we've made over the past years. And so that would include both maintaining those levels on getting a lot of echo there. So that would include maintaining a lot of the levels that we currently have accomplished, and would also include levels of funding for some of the providers, in particular community care, that conduct and accomplish those health service accomplishments. Regulatory, from a regulatory standpoint, there's an OIG audit of HHSC Deseret program. The audit itself is a audit of HHSC, and there is some mention or the findings relate to the community care collaborative. It's just a risk that's out there. HHSC has responded to the findings, and they're in agreement with one of the findings that is more of just a disclosure. They do not agree, nor does Central Health agree with the findings, the remaining findings. And then HIPAA and privacy, that's always a threat that there's some sort of breach or event that occurs that private information is somehow breached and falls into the wrong hands or the wrong hands related to that information. Cost to provide necessary levels of healthcare. We're undergoing a real big comprehensive systems of care analysis. Ultimately, we'll have some gaps that will be determined, and we'll have to determine how those gaps are funded. Even though we're not budgeting in fiscal year 2022 direct funding of hospital services, we anticipate that in future years, and is reflected in our plans. And then just any future pandemic or pandemic variant that may occur where it's infectious in nature and has a significant impact on how we deliver care or the amount of care that's required to deal with that pandemic or variant. And then on the Sendero side, the board has taken action at our last meeting to help mitigate any risk-based capital requirements and cash flow requirements due to the ACA risk adjustment payment, the timing of that payment. But nonetheless, Central Health as the parent would always have that risk over our head, regardless if there was a third party or there was some success. It's just a real volatile industry to be in. And so it would always should be considered when you talk about Central Health risk. So next slide, we'll begin talking about the reserve slides, just to orient everyone with the slides. The line that I pay the most attention to is the gray line, which shows the reserve levels over time. So we're looking at a kind of a 6-year forecast period post fiscal year 2022 budget. And we've used this tool for a number of years to look at an even year over year look at our tax rates, and overall based on projected spends and events, how does our tax rate look, and are we planning looking out into the future so that we don't find ourselves trying to have some sort of knee-jerk reaction to something that we should have planned for that might result in either revenue reductions or service reductions. And so when we look at the charts and we look at our tax rates, we pay attention to the reserve levels, the gray line, looking at the out years, and again in this case, the out years being fiscal year 23 through 28, and look at the impact of the reserve levels and the days of cash on hand. And so what we want to see, so we know based on events that we know about, and some of them I just mentioned, for example, the discontinuance of DESRA, the potential hospital funding model. We know that in the near future, we have a big hurdle to overcome related to in particular, the discontinuance of the DESRA program. And the board has been very appropriate in evaluating this over a number of years and maintaining a tax rate, a steady tax rate for that known event. And so as we look at our scenarios, we ran through a couple of scenarios. We initially were planning on presenting the budget at 6.9%, and I'll show you what that looks like here in just a second. But when we look at an effective rate or a 6% over the no new revenue rate, it shows a lot of the characteristics that we look for. So what we look for is we're building up our reserves in the next couple of years. So as you see here, fiscal year 23 is our peak. And we know that we're going to have to build up reserves because we'll use some of those reserves over time to accommodate some of the events that we know are going to happen. But what we're looking for at the far right-hand side is, are we leveling off, or are our reserve levels leveling off, and are we maintaining sufficient days of cash on hand to maintain the service levels that I think our community expects us to provide. And so when we look at the gray line, we see that although the revenue line, the reserve line is declining, so again, I'm looking at the gray line, that it begins to level off. And by fiscal year 2028, we are almost structurally balanced. And so when I say structurally balanced, I mean that when you look down at the table below, our sources are almost covering our uses. And again, we're leveling off on our reserve amounts and our days of cash on hand. So had we run this out one more year to fiscal year 29, you would have seen the amount level off. And again, that's the characteristic that we're looking for. And so I'll show you the next slide, which is 6.9%, just for comparison. And, you know, although it looks about the same, you see when you look at 6.9%, you see the reserves start dipping. So again, I'm looking at the gray line. So you see reserves dipping, but then they start upticking, and there's an upward trend. And when you look at the aggregate days of cash on hand at a year-over-year rate of 6.9%, but again, based on the modeling, those levels are greater than what we need to sustain, based on what we would foresee today that we would be doing in the future, even with a hospital risk model. These reserve levels are probably in excess of the amounts of reserves that we would need, again, based on what we know today. And then next slide shows we looked at 5% also. And so looking at 5% year over year, again, looking at the gray reserve line, it has a downward trend. The problem with that downward trend is that it continues, and there's really no foreseeable leveling off of that line in this 6-year period. And were it to start leveling off, which it probably would start leveling off maybe in 3 or 4 years, our reserve levels at that point would be much lower than we would want to have in those future periods. So again, this has been a tool that we've used over a number of years. And I think the commitment that we've made on the financial side is we'll continue to evaluate that, the impact of a tax rate and known events, and recommend the tax rate setting process based on these tools. And so based on our analysis, financial staff is recommending that, and again, this is the start of a very long process, so I want to be very clear about that, but that we prepare our initial budget at a 6% rate over the no new revenue rate. So I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to walk through some detail of our proposed budget and our year-end estimate for 21.
Thank you. So this is a summary of our sources and uses. We refer to it as Attachment A. And I wanted to just hit some of the highlights here. I'm going to focus on the sources and the year-end estimate, and then Lester's going to go through the details on the uses of funds in a little bit more detail, and we refer to that as Attachment B. So first of all, as we've just been talking about with the tax rate and tax revenue, you will see this variance. Okay, I'll just acclimate you to the chart. Last year's budget are this year's year-end estimate, which is where we think we'll end up at this point. It's fairly early, but we did make a year-end estimate. The proposed budget, and the variance is actually the difference between the two budgets. So just so you can orient to what we're looking at here. So in tax
Lisa?
revenue, we are,
Quick question, sorry.
yes,
The variance is a difference between the year-end estimate and proposed, or approved and proposed?
the two approved, the approved budget and the proposed budget.
That's what I thought, just wanted to clarify.
Budget versus budget.
Thank you.
So 30 million in additional tax revenue. I would like to highlight something that I've been talking to you about at the financial statement updates, though, in that we've had a lot of changes in Central Texas and a lot of variation in the valuation. And you'll recall that we do anticipate coming in significantly over that 234 million. We put a conservative estimate of 2 million over, but we did see additional valuation between the final roll and once the ARB and our friends at TCAD finished the whole process that is rapidly changing. We did see additional valuation in the 2020 tax values that is a part of that. So I just want to point that out. We've been talking about it with the financial statements, and so some of that is embedded in this year-over-year change, is that there was additional growth last year that's being accounted for. The other source of funds increase, we did increase, we continue to budget for tobacco litigation, but in other, we have increased that to account for possible grant revenue. We do anticipate grant revenue that you've been hearing about at the strategic planning level, and other sources. And so we've increased that as well. That includes also our interest revenue. So then I'd like to move now to this $226 million in contingency reserve carry forward as a source of funds in this proposed budget. So if we could focus on the second column for a minute, the second column here is where do we think we're going to end up this year? And as you know, we do prepare a structurally balanced budget. And so what we do is we look at what do we think our available resources will be at the end of the year, and we carry those forward to the future year. So based on our initial estimates, we are anticipating that we'll have about 22 million in additional sources of funds this year, primarily driven by additional property tax, as we've talked about, and the contingency reserve carry forward from the prior year being an available resource. So we will anticipate that. And then I will go through a little bit more of the details of our year-end estimate on the next slide. When it comes to the uses of funds, we anticipate of our budget of $367 million, about $161 million in uses of funds this year. That results in our sources over uses being about $226 million. That is carried forward as a source of funds for FY22. So I just want to kind of walk through the logistics of that, because we do appropriate that in the healthcare program. It's an available resource, and it will be there to fund future healthcare services. So before Lester goes through the other uses, I do think it's important to kind of highlight what happened this year and why is that estimate. It does have, on the uses side, about a $200 million variance. So a few of those changes or variations are highlighted here. And I'm going to try to focus on the higher dollar amounts one first. So every year we appropriate available resources as a contingency reserve in healthcare program, so it's available should we need it. Timing differences, planned things that we know are coming that we may need the dollars for. And last year that was $87 million. And so those funds are still available and will carry forward. We also had unspent funds in hospital and specialty services, as well as post-acute care, and those totaled about $65 million. We also had a decision to bond fund some of our capital projects. So you'll see in our debt reserves and transfers about $16.5 million that will not be spent because we've made the decision to use bond proceeds in order to fund the Del Valley and Hornsby Bend projects. So other areas we saw smaller amounts driving the variance this year. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about healthcare services, although I do want to highlight we will be back June 30th and the focus of our presentation will be on the budget for healthcare services, healthcare delivery, healthcare operations, a lot more detailed information and great conversation about what we plan to do in FY22. But you will see, and again, I go back to our financial statement updates, that we are anticipating not spending the full budgeted amount in primary care and specialty care for many of the reasons that we've talked about, reduced utilization, we suspect due to COVID, as well as other areas that we've highlighted in the past in the financial statement presentations. So I wanted to just walk through why our year-end estimate looks significantly less than the budget. There are some significant drivers, such as that contingency reserve carry forward that's an available resource and that we will maintain as an available resource as we may need it in the future for future initiatives that Jeff highlighted. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lester Hanaher, our budget analyst, and he's going to go through some of the details of the variance between the 2022 proposed budget and the 2021 approved budget in the areas of uses of funds.
Thank you, Lisa. And good evening, managers. I'm Lester Hanaher, the budget analyst at Central Health. And tonight I'll be walking you through the attachment B. So we're starting with the healthcare delivery program. As Lisa and Jeff had both mentioned, DISRIP is winding down. So we're planning a reduction to the IGT payment of about $8 million. Lisa also mentioned 12 business cases for the healthcare delivery program that were reviewed and approved through our business case process. You can find a lot of these dollars, about $7.1 million of these initiatives can be found spread across the primary, specialty, and post-acute care lines. Some examples of these initiatives include street medicine to expand healthcare for the homeless, a sobering center and peer support to provide access to patients with substance use disorder. Specialty care is expanding to include now neurology and nephrology, among many other focus areas. Also, in anticipation of a transition from 6 to 12 months of eligibility, we've included $2 million for additional MAP coverage. On the primary and specialty care reserve lines, you can see an increase of $2 million. This is for MAP basic service expansion. In these areas, they're including to expand to urgent care access, pharmacy, and post-acute care. In FY22, you can see we're not planning hospital services. This includes the hospital and specialty service line, as well as the incentives, and it also includes the $5.4 million that Lisa pointed out for post-acute. Next slide, please. The eligibility team is planning to expand the chat program to include 750 new members. You can see that from a dollar perspective at about $1.5 million. The increase that's outlined on the salary and benefits is tied to some of our business cases. This includes 24 new positions across eligibility, joint tech, as well as the development for a clinical practice. Some of the positions were previously contractors that were converting into staff. So you'll notice on the other professional services line that there is actually a decreased plan there. Next slide, please. We're planning to transfer $4.3 million to the capital reserve this year. This is to continue funding capital programs that were approved by the board. Central Health continues to prepare a structurally balanced budget, and we appropriate the remaining funds to the healthcare delivery program. And this is captured under the contingency reserve appropriation. And this year that amount is $311 million. The debt service line is increasing, driven by the issuance of new COs anticipated for Eastern Travis County clinics, as well as the administration facility. Next slide, please. Now we're looking at the administration program for the FY22 budget. In this area, there were 8 business cases that were reviewed and approved to support the healthcare initiatives and build towards operational excellence. These include continued development in hub and DEI programs, as well as incremental growth in some of the departments. We're also planning for organizational development in the HR area. Next slide, please. So this is the outline for the FY22 budget timeline. So we've been through a few meetings now, and today we're here presenting the first pass FY22 budget. We'll come back, and as Lisa mentioned, the June 30th meeting will focus more specifically on the healthcare delivery lines. So we'll take a deeper dive into that. In July, we get our final certified values from Travis Central Appraisal District. This will give us our final revenue numbers that will allow us to model out the rest of our final budget numbers. We'll come back in August with updated numbers. Next slide, please. Oh, no, this is right. On August 25th, we'll work to set the maximum tax rate. Then going into September, we'll hold the public hearing. And on September 9th, the board will vote to approve the tax rate and FY22 budget. From there, we go to the Commissioners Court, September 21st, for the budget and tax rate adoption. And that's the end of our budget presentation. Are there any questions?
I think they're going to submit their questions in writing.
That's correct.
So as this was just informational, it was informational, there'll be, there's no motion necessary. And since I know we have lots and lots of questions, and if it's not something that is better to be given in writing, we can go over the budget. I know that there's been some issues with being able to see the slides. It's really would be better to have it done in writing so that we can get all the questions out. And we're having a meeting again in 2 more weeks where they can really get it out, get you really clear questions answered, and make you some slides and any sort of information that you need. So I think that's the preferred way that we'll be running it this way. Sherry, does that sound okay? I know that this is not preferred for many members that there is, but it's a special meeting. It's on a day that we don't usually meet.
Certainly, I think it would be great for staff to get all those questions in writing so that they can prepare answers and either meet with members, before our next meeting, or get that information to them and to others, all of the board, and then be prepared. We are meeting again on June 30th. Is that correct?
That's correct, June 30th. That'll give you time to read and to give feedback. And since I'm not going to allow everyone to ask questions about as I can't allow you to do one also, just to be fair.
No, I don't think it's fair for you to make a unilateral decision without us having had, as board members, who are legally responsible and liable for central actions.
Yes.
And so I have at least one very important
question. You should have many questions, and I'm sure you have many questions.
One is very
and this was just
right, Julie.
I can hear you. No, ma'am, not at this time.
This is to David. Duncan is our lawyer, and to
he's the one who said I could run the meeting like this.
Jeff, and we were not told this beforehand. We were not told.
You don't have to be told this beforehand.
I'm sorry, but I don't live in Nazi Germany, and I really do not.
Oh, hold on. I don't want you to be misunderstood. I don't want you to be misunderstood. I don't want you to be misunderstood.
Well, I have one very important question that is going to affect Central Health, and I want to know this thing about the Office of the Inspector General not approving or having a question about some of our expenditures in the DSRIP program, and I want to know if Central Health is going to be held responsible if they continue to not accept them, and for how much. Is it 60 million, 100 million? And I want questions about this. Is in fact one of the reasons that we're holding on to contingency fund monies. I just want to know what the issue is, because we have not been told the details about this. And as a board, that is dealing with our fiscal responsibility and liability. And I'd like to know what the issue is.
Manager Valdez, that's kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about. Not that it's not part of the budget, but that's something we need to. That's something we need to do in closed session. We need to not opine too deeply and too broadly on what that. When we start using the L word, I start getting nervous.
Me too.
Liability, and so we shouldn't go on about this. We really shouldn't.
I understand that. So then, Chair Suniga, I need for us to make sure that we put this on the agenda, or Sherry, put it on for our board agenda, so we can have a closed session discussion about what possible risk or liabilities we have.
So this is the budget meeting. Is this the appropriate time to be doing this?
Spent dollars on. That's the budget.
Sorry.
That is the budget.
Sorry, Manager Valdez.
It's the board. You don't know. Maybe you don't
It
know.
is appropriate to discuss scheduling of future items. So
Scheduling a
we'll,
future
we'll
appointment.
work with
Okay.
Manager Valdez and we'll get that scheduled for a future
That's
agenda.
great.
Um,
Thank you.
very
Mr.
much.
Valdez, we will work with legal counsel to get that scheduled, but I do want to point out, as Manager Zuniga did, that you have to be careful with comments that you're making so that you're not misunderstood. It's very important that we maintain that as as a public body, that
I
comments
understand.
are not
I appreciate that, Sherry. I really do. That's why I'm concerned about having heard that little slip in there in the report that was being made by Lisa. That's why the only reason I'm bringing it up, because it's the first time I've heard that there was a question about that. And now I want to know what the issue is and how much money are we possibly at risk for? Because we're going to have to pay for it if in case we're found to be having spent our money the way we're not approved to spend it.
Mr. Giesling, did you have a question?
No, ma'am, I don't have a question. But I would like to, if I may, point out that there is a conversation that we can have around that. It will go back and pick up other conversations that we've had with the board and providing all the information to you that we have, including what HHSC has told us, which the board has received before, but we're happy to provide it again. And I think when you hear that again, you'll realize, oh, this is not the first time we've heard about this. But I don't want to assume for you, but I hope that you do come to that conclusion, because
I appreciate that. I'd like to know the
extensive time on that. But Manager, but Chair Zuniga, we can, I don't know that it's for the Budget and Finance Committee. I think really it's probably for a board meeting that we set that agenda item and then come back to rebrief the board on it.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you very much, Sherry. And I do want to know the dollar amount. Thank you.
Sherry Greenberg, did you have a question? Or
no, ma'am, no questions. Thank you.
Great. So I encourage you to take time with the budget and to get it back, get questions and written back to the staff so that they can get questions. This is only the beginning of the conversation. This is by no means the end of it. You saw by the schedule that it is not going to be voted on for a little while. So you have plenty of time to be talking with our staff who's worked so hard to get the budget together. So we'll be moving forward with that.
I just want to make sure they send it to us because I haven't seen it.
That's
Not like this. Thank you.
So you wanted something else, and so whatever you need sent to you, email to Lisa.
I didn't see this presentation. If somebody
Yes, this was the first. Thank you. This was the
right.
first.
Thank you.
Yes, this was the first presentation, and that's all it was the first jumping off point, so you can see the numbers.
Yeah, no, I would like for it to be sent to us. Thank you.
Manager Valadez, Brianna will resend it and then I'll print a copy for you.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Pedla. Okay.
Great. So the next item on the agenda is to confirm the next regular budget and finance meeting date, time, and location. Managers, we do not currently have any upcoming scheduled budget and finance committee meeting. If a need arises to hold a budget and finance meeting, committee members will be consulted and advised in advance. At this time, I'm ready to accept a motion of adjournment.
Point of order, question.
Yes.
Have we considered for budget and finance or for the board meeting at all when we might return to in-person meetings?
Oh, that is still, I haven't actually heard. Yes, Chair Greenberg.
Mr. Giesland, do you want to address that? There have been some initial conversations, Manager Jones.
Yes. So a lot of it hinges on the emergency declaration orders and when and whether those expire, that we do come back into in-person meetings. But at the same time, what we've also talked about is having a virtual option, like we've done with members before. I think Manager Akins, as well as Manager Musaitif and others, Chair Greenberg, that have had to, and I might be leaving some others out, but trying to figure out a way that we can do that to accommodate those that need to come in virtually. But it's still up in there at this point. I would defer to legal counsel to see if there's a more specific date on the expiration of the disaster declaration.
Yeah, the disaster declaration is renewed by statute monthly, and we're watching that very carefully. We have no way of predicting what the governor's going to do. The disaster declarations themselves have almost more to do with federal financing and FEMA requirements than they do with whether you would actually consider it a disaster, a current ongoing disaster. The disaster declaration for Hurricane Harvey is still in place more than 3 years later. So it or about 3 years later. I'm sorry, Chair Greenberg.
Yes, thank you. So yes, a lot of those have to do with being eligible as a disaster for federal funding and whatnot. I don't in any shape or form anticipate us waiting 3 years if these were to stay in place, Manager Jones. And as I said, Mr. Giesel and I have had some initial conversations about returning, and those are ongoing, and about, I think what he was stating is a hybrid approach potentially when we return, because we do have the availability once we have to have a quorum in person if we're meeting in person, is my understanding, but then additional members could participate virtually. And we have done that before when members had to be out of town for, family emergencies or whatnot.
Manager
Okay.
Valdez?
Yes, thank you. Well, since, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't the public hearing today supposed to be in person? And if it was in person, then why would we expect the public to come and give testimony and we as a board do not? So I think that's something that we should really consider about sending missed messages. We just really need to establish a policy. People can submit testimony virtually, just like they can in person. So I'd consider us meeting, considering that, so we can resolve that issue, so that we're not seeing as doing something for one group and something for another group. Thank you.
Yes, Manager Greenberg?
Yes, I understand. As I said, we're in conversations looking at when we can come back as a board in person. As you know, we're not meeting in July, so that our staff can both, I hope, get some much needed rest and continue working on the budget, right? But we will be back. We have a June 30th meeting. We will not be meeting in July. There are ongoing conversations and looking at, yes, a hybrid model where hopefully we could continue with members of the public who didn't want to or weren't able, or if our room is too small to come in person, they could do public participation virtually. But we are in discussions, working on all of this, Manager Valadez.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Mr. Giesling?
Actually, Chair Greenberg covered it,
Okay.
that it's inclusive of public participation.
Thank you.
Okay, so do we have a motion to adjourn? Manager Mislights, if you're ready.
I move to move adjourn the meeting.
Great, and we have a second by Sherry Greenberg. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Great, meeting's adjourned, and we'll be back on our regular next meeting. So thanks, guys, for a short meeting. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you, members.